Okay, ready? Good evening. I want to thank you for joining us this evening in our Bible study here on Wednesday evening at the Waverly Church of Christ. You may notice that we've got a little bit different background. We're here in the auditorium today and doing it live as we did last week, trying to see how that goes for us. We do covet your input to let us know how that comes across for you. But tonight I want to kind of set up our study in another one of the Psalms with a little bit of background, but I want to begin with this statement, and it is this: evil does exist in our world. If you go back to John chapter 3, Jesus in his nighttime meeting with Nicodemus, a member of the Sanhedrin, there in John chapter 3 verse 19 said that there were those who loved darkness rather than the light, and the reason he said they did that was because their deeds were evil. If you go over to his Sermon on the Mount, there in Matthew chapter 6, you find him talking about the prayer that his followers were to pray. And part of that prayer was to God to deliver them or deliver us from evil. There in Matthew 6, verse 13. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the church at Rome, there in Romans chapter 12, verse 9, wrote to the Christians and told them to abhor what is evil and to cling to what is good. And then just a few verses later, down in verse 21, he said, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. In the psalm that I would like for us to examine this evening, we see evil. And it is because of the evil in which a man engages that David writes Psalm 52. But to have a better understanding of the mindset that provokes, or maybe I should say that prompts David to write this, we need to first go back and look at the background behind it. And that background is found in 1 Samuel chapters 21 and 22. So I'm going to go back there first to kind of bring us up to let us see why David writes the psalm, and then go directly into the psalm. There was a king over Israel. It was the first king of Israel. His name was Saul. And Saul had initially started out as a pretty good king, but there came a point in time where he had stopped following God as he should, and God withdrew his spirit from Saul and allowed an evil spirit to take up residence within Saul. And that evil spirit began to torment him. Well, David became the object of Saul's wrath. Saul became very jealous of David. As a matter of fact, he wanted to kill David. And in order to do that, he finally just drove him out and would end up pursuing him for quite some time. When David fled from Saul there in Gibeah, his wife Micah, who just happened to be Saul's daughter, helped him down out of a window and then tried to keep everyone from knowing that he had left. And David fled from there and went north to Ramah. But in Ramah, Samuel, the prophet, told him, you can't stay here. You need to go. So from Ramah, he went south to the city of Nob. There in Nob, the tabernacle stood, and there were the priests who officiated in the tabernacle on a regular basis. Well, David and his men had nothing much to eat, if anything at all. And David had fled with almost nothing but the clothes on his back. And so he went to the priest Ahimelech, and he asked him if he had 5 loaves of bread or anything that his men might eat. And Ahimelech told him that the only thing that he had, the only thing that was available was the consecrated bread or the bread of presence that had just been removed from the tabernacle. You see, under the law of Moses, every Sabbath day that bread was to be taken out and fresh bread was to be put in its place, and it would sit there for an entire week before it too was taken out. So fresh bread had just been put in, the old bread had been removed, and that bread was available. And so he ended up giving that bread to David. David asked him if he had anything in the way of a weapon that he might use, and he said there's the sword of Goliath, so he got it. Watching all of this as it transpired was another individual, a servant of King Saul, a man who just happened to be the chief of his shepherds. He was an Edomite by the name of Doeg. He had witnessed all of this as it had taken place. Well, David and his men leave there. They make their way over into Philistine territory to the city of Gath, but the Philistines, who are enemies of the Israelites, want nothing to do with him. So he ends up leaving there and makes his way back to a place south of Jerusalem known as the Cave of Adullam. And he thinks he can hide out there, but another prophet comes to him, a prophet by the name of Gad, and he says, it's not safe. You need to leave here. So David makes his way to what was known as the Forest of Hereth. And that's where he and some 400 men who have chosen to follow him are now hiding out. Meanwhile, back in Gibeah, King Saul is sitting under a tamarisk tree up on a hill, and he's surrounded by his servants. And he begins to complain and say that everybody is against him, that there's a conspiracy against him. As a matter of fact, if you notice in verses 7 and 8 here in 1 Samuel chapter 21, we see what what King Saul says. He says, "Remember now, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give to all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? For all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you who is sorry for me, or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush, as it is this day." In his mind, there was a great conspiracy, and his son was involved in it, and so was David, and he would never have rest until it was dealt with. Well, one of King Saul's servants just happens to be there and hears all that's being said, and he speaks up. His name, you guessed it, Doeg the Edomite. And what he tells King Saul is that, "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub. He inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." Well, that was all that Saul needed to hear. He immediately sent to Nob and summoned Ahimelech and the priest who were with him and had them come there to Gibeah. And when Ahimelech and the other priests arrived, Saul began to accuse him of joining in this conspiracy with David against him, that is, against King Saul. But Ahimelech denied the charge. And in verse 14 we find him saying, "Who among all your servants is as faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard and is honored in your house?" He's saying, why would he be in a conspiracy against you? He's your son-in-law. He's the captain of your guard. He's a man that you honor in your own house. Why would anybody ever suspect him of engaging in a conspiracy against you? But Saul wouldn't listen to him, even though Ahimelech said he knew nothing about the affair. Saul would not listen, and instead he told him, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household." And at that point, Saul ordered his guards to turn upon these men and to take the lives of these priests of God. But they wouldn't do it. They would not do it because these men were priests of God. So at that point, Saul turned to Doeg, and he told Doeg, "You turn around and attack the priest." This man of Edom, this man who had no part in Israel's God. And he did. He turned around and he began to attack those priests, but he did far more than that. And we read about it here in verses 18 and 19 of 1 Samuel chapter 22. It says, "And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priest, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And he struck Nob, the city of the priest, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, and sheep he struck with the edge of the sword." This man massacred 85 men. And then he went from Gibeah down to Nob, and he began to massacre all of the women and all of the children and all of the oxen and the donkeys and the sheep he put to death. One person escaped. That one person, as best we know, his name was Abiathar. And he fled from there back to where David was hidden, there in the forest of Hereth. And he told David all that had happened. And David said to him, as we have recorded for us in verse 22 of this chapter, I knew on that day, when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. We cannot begin to imagine the grief that David must have felt when he learned that all of these innocent people had been murdered by this man, simply because he and his men had stopped there and requested something to eat and a sword and perhaps a blessing of God. It's out of this series of events, out of this heartache, out of the grief he must have felt, that David sat down and wrote this psalm. And as you read this psalm, Psalm 52, you find David beginning it with a question of accusation. He says, why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? It's as if he is speaking directly to Doeg, as if Doeg is right there in front of him. Why do you boast in this evil, O mighty man? Not only did Doeg carry out this evil deed, but he also boasted in what he had done. And David said, the loving kindness of God endures all day long. You see, such evil and boasting stood in stark contrast to the loving kindness of God, the goodness of God, the steadfast love of God, which, as David wrote, endures all day long. And David said, your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor, O worker of deceit. What prompted Doeg to do these things? I think there was a heart issue. It is the fact that Doeg had an evil heart, a wicked heart. Look at what David says about him there in verses 3 and 4. He says, you love evil more than good, falsehood more than speaking what is right. You love all the words that devour, O deceitful tongue. You may remember that David was the captain of Saul's bodyguard. David had fought battle after battle on behalf of Israel. The soldiers knew David and David knew the soldiers, and no doubt David knew, because David was a son-in-law to Saul. David knew the servants within Saul's household, and he must have known this Doeg. He must have known things about Doeg just from observing him and watching him and hearing perhaps others speak about him. And listen to what he says. You love evil more than good, falsehood more than speaking what is right. You love all words that devour, O deceitful tongue. What you see here is that Doeg's sense of morality was all wrong. Doeg was the one who was, we might say, twisted by his own depravity. So how does David respond to all of this? David responds by speaking about the judgment which he believes God will bring down upon this man, this murderer of innocent people. He says, but God will break you down forever. Verse 5. He will snatch you up and tear you away from your tent and uproot you from the land of the living. David believed that God would bring down destruction upon this arrogant enemy. But I want you to look at the terms that David used to portray the way in which God would do this. He says, He will break you down. He will snatch you up. He will tear you away. He will uproot you. It's almost as if you have a picture of this gigantic hand just reaching down and taking this man and just breaking him, snatching him up, tearing him away from whatever he may be holding on to, uprooting him as if you just pull a tree right out of the ground. He knew that death would remove forever this man from the land of the living, and he believed that's what God would do to Doeg. But David also spoke about the response of the righteous to this man and to what God would do to him. He said, the righteous will see and fear and will laugh at him, saying, behold, the man who would not make God his refuge, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and was strong in his evil desire. David believed that Doeg's destruction at the hand of God would be so devastating that the righteous would see it and then they would be motivated to fear God. But they would also laugh at what had taken place, what had happened to Doeg, and they would say that this is what happens to the man who, as they said, would not make God his refuge. This man who trusted in the abundance of his own riches. This man who took refuge in his own destructive behavior. God would destroy this man because of the type of person he was. He was evil, pure and simple. What about David? What does David say about himself? Well, he speaks of the confidence he has. He compares himself to a green olive tree. He said, "But as for me, I am like a green olive tree in the house of God." Well, Doeg's faith had been in his own wily ways, in his deceit, and in things that he did. David's faith was in God. And David, as I said, saw himself as that green olive tree in the house of God. He was planted in the place where he would prosper, where he would thrive, where he would be close to God. And that's what gave him his confidence. He referred to himself as a green olive tree planted in the house of God. Doeg, on the other hand, is a tree that God uproots and snatches away. In verse 1, after saying to Doeg, "Why do you boast in evil?" David then said, "The kindness of God endures all day long." David now comes back in verse 8 to speak about that kindness yet again, and he said, "I trust in the loving kindness of God forever and ever." And David concludes this psalm with his response. He says, "I will give you thanks forever because you have done it, and I will wait on your name, for it is good in the presence of your godly ones." David vowed that he would go on giving thanks, that he would go on praising God forever because of the good that he believed God had done and would continue to do. David promised to wait on, to hope in God's name in the presence of God's holy ones, that is, God's saints. Why? Because God's name, that which God is and that which God does, is good. So what are we to take away from this psalm this evening? I believe it's this. When you or I find ourselves surrounded by troubles and under attack, we must rely upon God more and more. He is our stronghold. He is our fortress. He is our refuge. As the psalmist wrote in Psalm 121, verses 7 and 8, "The Lord will protect you from all evil. He will keep your soul. The Lord will guard your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore." Let me ask you a question. Is the Lord the defense of your life? I hope that He is. But if He's not, why not make Him so today? If we can help you here accomplish that, those of us here at the Waverly Church of Christ want to do that for you today. Please reach out to us, call us, and let us know how we can be of assistance to you. But we want you to come to know the God that we love and serve. And we want you to have the joy that comes from being a part of His family. Thank you for being a part of this study with us this evening. And I do pray that God will bless you and yours during these days.